Okay. Greetings from Christ the King Episcopal Church and from Kelly Plantation. We're here with Tom Potts, a Christ the King parishioner, and we're here to talk about the centurion that we are going to hear about in this coming Sunday's gospel lesson. Jesus heals a centurion's servant. And when I was preparing for my sermon, I thought, gosh, I need to give Tom Potts a call to talk about this Roman centurion. But before we jump into that, I wanted to give Tom an opportunity to introduce himself to those who are watching. So Tom, tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, your relationship to Christ the King.
Well, I'm married to Karen. We have two children, one in Tulsa, one in Charlotte, and David and Carrie. We have two grandchildren, one in Tulsa, one in Charlotte. The daughter has the grandson, the son has the granddaughter, which I find to be there is justice in this world.
Says the lawyer.
Yeah, says the lawyer. I was an attorney in Tulsa for probably 35 years. I actually grew up in Oklahoma City, but spent most of my time in Tulsa. Went to the University of Oklahoma, and I have 2 law degrees and a business degree. And I actually practiced in the government, practiced in the corporate sector, and practiced in private practice for most of my career. We moved down here full-time in 2012, but we had a vacation house that we had in Sandestin since the year 2000. We first attended Christ the King on Ash Wednesday, 2006, and met Frank Cooper. In the intervening 6 years, we kept coming down more and more to the vacation house. And when we came down, we attended Christ the King usually throughout that entire time. And when we came in 2012, we transferred our membership from St. John's Episcopal Church in Tulsa to Christ the King, and we've been ever since.
Good. Well, thank you for that bit of history. And tell me this, Tom, how and when did you get interested in Roman military history?
I took an ancient history course in college at the University of Oklahoma, and the professor was outstanding. He was almost 80 years old, and he lived and breathed ancient history, and he loved the Roman history, and he made it come to life. And ever since I guess it was either sophomore or junior year of college, I became fascinated with Roman history, and it's almost become a hobby of mine to study it. And I've studied it approximately, 50 years.
Wow. Okay. Well, the way I knew about Tom's interest is we have a Friday morning men's breakfast and Bible study that meets at Christ the King in Sandifer Hall every Friday at 8 a.m. All men are invited to come be a part of it. Of course, now we're not meeting in person for the time being, but we still meet via Zoom and are studying the book of James. But whenever something comes up in our lesson that might have to do with a centurion or Pontius Pilate or a legion or anything like that, we hit pause and ask Tom to fill us in on what all those terms mean. And so I've been deeply impressed, Tom, with your knowledge in that, and it's helped our Bible studies a great deal. And that brings me to my next question. Has your interest in and studying of ancient Roman history changed or affected or informed how you read the Bible or hear the Bible?
It puts a lot of it into context.
Mm-hmm.
When I read and I guess it particularly comes into fore when you're talking about somebody like Pontius Pilate,
mm-hmm.
because then you learn his background, which I have and know, and I've expressed that to the men's group. And it also shows you what was going on contemporaneously in the world, and more importantly, the Roman Empire at the time. The various Bible and the gospel studies have gone on, and particularly with Acts and with Paul's letters and Peter's letters. It puts everything into context. And when they make a reference to a city, I generally know where that city is. When
Yeah.
I make a reference to a country, I generally know where that particular country is, and that helps. It makes it much more meaningful.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree. And it helps remind us that the Bible didn't come out of the clouds or wasn't written in a vacuum. It was written in a time and a place. Um, well, good. All right. Well, rolling into our particular topic today, as some of you who are watching this may know, last Sunday I began a summer sermon series called "The Miracles in Matthew." And each Sunday, our gospel lesson is going to be from Matthew's gospel and is going to look at the various miracles that happen throughout that gospel. And the one for this coming Sunday is chapter 8 of Matthew, beginning in verse 5. And it is when Jesus heals the centurion's servant. And the centurion approaches Jesus immediately after Jesus healed the man with leprosy. Jesus didn't even get to take a breath or take a nap. The centurion showed up and said, well, I've got this servant who's paralyzed and in bed. Can you heal him? And so tell us, Tom, who or what would this centurion have been?
I'm going to make the assumption that this centurion was a member of the regular Roman army, meaning he was in a regular Roman army unit. Rome basically maintained two parallel armies. They maintained their regular Roman army, which was manned by only the citizens. You had to be a citizen to join the Roman army, and that's the ones everybody sees in the movies. Those are the legions. I'll make a reference. Rome also maintained various auxiliary troops, allied troops that came from the conquered territories. They were considered Roman troops. They acted like Roman troops. They even were organized a lot like the main Roman troops. But I want to focus in on the main Roman army here. In the main Roman army, the smallest operational infantry unit was a century. A century commanded by a centurion. Now, before we get beyond that, I'd like to discuss a little bit about the legion itself. The basic Roman army operating unit was a legion. A legion was commanded at this time by what's called a legate, who was appointed by the emperor and nominally approved by the Senate in Rome. And I do mean nominally, they weren't going to buck him. This person invariably, at least up to the reign of Marcus Aurelius, was a member of the senatorial class, the highest class in Rome, where they came with the highest families. They were the members of the Senate. They were assigned to, that one individual was assigned to command the legion. Subordinate under him, there were 6 tribunes. 5 of them came from the equestrian class, and many people don't understand this, but Rome really had 3 major classes of citizens. They had the senatorial class, they had the equestrian class, of which Pontius Pilate was a member of the equestrian class, and then they had the plebs, and then they had the slaves and freedmen. There were various rankings of plebs, but I don't want to get into that. So there was essentially 3 classes. Of the 6 tribunes, 5 of them were equestrians, and 1 of them was of the senatorial class. His job, the senatorial class tribune, was to learn how to be a legate so he could command a legion. Under the legion commander, there were 10 subordinate units called a cohort, 10 of them. Cohort 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 was composed of 6 centuries of 80 men each, for a total of 480 troops. The first cohort, which was the bedrock cohort of the legion, was a larger one. It formed the right side of the legion when they lined up in their battle lines. It was composed of the top fighters and veterans in the entire legion and had 5 senior centurions. It only had 5 centuries of 160 men each, twice the size of a regular century. Those 5 centurions were known as premiordines, very senior and had a lot of battle experience. The first century of those 5 was commanded by a person called the primus pilus, the first spear of the legion. And he was the big guy in charge of all the other centurions, senior of most. So what we have is we have this unit. You have 59 centurions in a regular Roman legion. I'll make the assumption that this centurion we're talking about here, coming out of Capernaum, was one that commanded an 80-man century. And I believe in the study it says, when I tell them to go, they go. When I tell them to come, they come. And let me assure you, in a Roman legion, that's exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. They were told what to do, they did it. Mm-hmm. If the centurion told them what to do, they did it. He was their boss. Mm-hmm. He had some subordinate officers that helped him, but he was the overall in charge of the actual century.
Okay. Well, good. And that's, yeah, Tom is referencing sort of the end of that passage where he is recognizing a kinship, perhaps, with Jesus, and it's saying, I understand authority because I have it myself, and I see it in you, albeit maybe differently. So we're both people who have the authority to make things happen. And Jesus, I need you to make something happen for me. Good. Well, tell me this. But it's the centurion who's approached Jesus to ask Jesus to heal his servant. And it's one remarkable thing about this passage is that he has so much belief in Jesus's power or authority that he says, Jesus, you don't even have to go to my house to do it. You don't have to lay hands on him. Just say the word and he will be healed. And so that's a remarkable thing. But tell me this, the actual servant who was sick or paralyzed or laid up, whatever, did a centurion typically have a servant? Is that just part of the thing that he had a little team of folks who worked for him? Did he own them like slaves? Did the servant get paid a wage? Was the servant in a different social class? Give me an idea of who this servant might have been.
By and large, Roman centurions at this time, and we're talking the very end of the first century BCE and the first century CE, AD, for the rest of us that know if you're not politically correct. All the centurions generally had a slave that was a valet / cook, for lack of a better term. After a person had been centurion for a while, the duties of the job were such that you didn't have time to do certain things. You couldn't associate with the men. You were an officer, you were a leader, you were expected to remain somewhat aloof. So you ended up, or most of them, ended up acquiring a slave. And the slave was, as I said, a valet, and it was also a cook. And that the slave was responsible for maintaining the centurion's uniform, meaning cleaning his armor, cleaning his helmet, making sure his gladius and pugio were sharpened that he wore, made sure his clothes were there, made sure his food was cooked. If, as many of them did, centurions tried to find a slave that was somewhat literate so they could also help them with the paperwork, only that was not paper at that time. Right. It was clay tablets, and running information back and forth up to the praetorium, to the senior centurion, and up to the legate. Most of the slaves generally starred a network so that anything that happened in the praetorium got back through the slave valet quicker than it got from the officers down to the centuries. That's very typical in a military unit. But yes, that's typical, and they stayed with the centurion unless the centurion was killed. At that time, perhaps a centurion replacement would then buy from the estate itself, and I hate to use that term, but that's essentially what you're talking about, would acquire that slave and go on. Mm-hmm. After many, many years, some of these slaves were given freedman status. That could either be on the centurion's retirement, or when he was senior enough to where it didn't really matter. He'd had him for 20 years, so he would keep him. You have to keep in mind when people signed up for the legions that it was a 25-year commitment.
Oh, wow.
There is one thing interesting about this, and I think you asked me this, Richard, in a preliminary. What caste system did the Roman Centurion come from? And we'll discuss him now. For most of the Republic, prior to Augustus and the Principate, centurions came up through the ranks. They were part of the plebs. Back in the ancient Republic, you couldn't serve unless you were a landowner, and you were divided up into classes. As time went on, landowners became scarce, the senators began to buy up everything, and people moved to the cities, Rome and some of the other cities. As gradually citizenship was expanded, it became necessary for Rome to say, look, we no longer need landowners, we just need bodies. And we don't care if you own land, as long as you're a citizen, you can join the legion. So these people were the plebs, they joined the legion, they didn't have a lot, and they would go out and they would fight. When they first joined with Marius in about 102 BCE, they joined for 15 years. And that gradually was expanded down to Augustus to a total of 25 years. But centurions were generally promoted through the ranks. Mm-hmm. You would join, and if you're dealing in an 80-person century, the first basic unit was 8 men composed of contubernium, much like a squad in today's army. Mm-hmm. The first rank there was the senior man in the contubernium, or a decanus, much like a squad leader or sergeant. Another rank they had was a thesaurus, which was a training officer and the man that was the keeper of the password for the century. Finally, the actual centurion had an assistant called an optione, the chosen one, shortened to optio. He was the deputy centurion. So a man would be promoted up through these ranks, and as one would be, centurions were expected to lead from the front in the Roman army. You didn't stand in the back and egg people on. That was the optio's job. He had a big stick and would force them forward. The legion was run by the centurions, and they were expected to fight forward. In fact, many centurions didn't even carry a shield. They would pick one up in a battle. So as you can imagine, the casualty rate among centurions was rather high. In major battles, it would not be unusual to lose 15 or 20 centurions out of 59.
Wow.
So the promotion rate was there, and they tended to promote up. Now, it wasn't necessarily you stayed in the same century. You could have gone up to optio in your century, and in another cohort, a centurion was killed. And the senior centurion, the primus pellus, said, I like this guy down in your century. Your optio is going to move over to become the centurion in another cohort. So there was upward mobility. Mm-hmm. That's how generally centurions were found. Now, starting with Augustus, a new system came in. It became so good and so lucrative to be a centurion because of the loot, booty, and everything else you could get, that several equestrians applied to Augustus to be appointed directly into the centurionate. And he did it. He did it for money, for the basic way of just getting money, and he'd appoint them. So all centurions were not promoted up through the ranks. Some of them were directly appointed by the emperor to come in and take over. There was a lot of heat between the two. The ones that had fought their way up didn't particularly care for the new ones. I don't know if this guy here that we have was an up through the ranks centurion. I don't know if he was a appointed centurion from Tiberius or even Augustus, if he'd been around a while. So that gives you a little history of how the centurions and where they came from.
Yeah, interesting. And another question I would have is typically what would, he had encountered Jesus, right? In this encounter that we read about, and Jesus is this Jewish man, this Jewish, whether he saw him as a prophet, a religious leader, a religious teacher, a rabble rouser, the centurion would have at least known that Jesus was Jewish. What would the centurion's religious worldview be? What was he certainly wasn't Jewish, right? I mean,
unless he was amongst the auxiliary troops, he might have been there. That could have been, but we're making the assumption he wasn't.
Right.
Normally, I'm quite surprised by this, and because he would have at that time had been presumably a state a state person of the state religion, meaning he followed the pantheon of Roman gods.
Mm-hmm.
Jupiter, Juno, Neptune, Minerva, that group here,
Mm-hmm.
Apollo, Vulcan, Vesta.
Mm-hmm.
He would have worshipped all of those there.
Right.
And I have no idea how we'd have gotten there. I can postulate something. During this time frame, and for most of history up to about 200 AD or CE, the Roman army did not allow anyone below the rank of tribune to actually be married, and they didn't like the tribunes being married. And the legate had to leave his wife at home.
Mm.
So no one could be married. Well, you can imagine how that worked.
Mm-hmm.
By and large, virtually every centurion, optio officer, and probably half of the legionaries at the legionary base maintained an informal family.
Mm-hmm.
They had a wife. Now, sometimes they would go see them once or twice a week. They had children with them. Centurion had a little more latitude to go see them. Now, they were not formally married. They could not be formally married.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody knew what was going on. It was probably the biggest wink, wink, nod, nod deal going on in the history of mankind.
So don't ask, don't tell didn't start with the U.S. military, huh?
Exactly. It was don't ask, don't tell. We know you've got a woman in town and a family. We don't want you acknowledging that.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it got so bad that the signifer in a century was responsible for the burial fund. In other words, people put money in so that something died, they could be buried, they could have a gift made to the gods or something like that, or the money could be given to their informal family.
Mm.
So it was that formalized on an informal basis that they knew where the money would go.
Okay.
So it was very interesting on that.
Right. Okay, so yeah, this is a fascinating story to think, why would this centurion even see that Jesus could help him out? They're not even praying to the same God per se, but clearly he saw something in Jesus, and Jesus saw something in him because he said, wow, your faith is remarkable. So anyhow, well, this has been very helpful.
Well, let me finish one point. He may have had an informal Jewish wife.
Ah, okay.
The
Right.
centurion. I don't know that.
Right.
But as with any wife, he was probably hearing the stories of Jesus. I find it very interesting that he would come to recognize Jesus this fast.
Right.
The only thing I could say is maybe he heard from his wife or her friends about this.
Right. Well, good. Well, this has been very fun for me, and I hope that those watching have learned something, and it sparked your interest to dig into the context of some of these stories that we're hearing from the Bible that we don't have time to get into from the pulpit, or the trap door would open and then I would go down after about 20 minutes. But it's good to use this as an opportunity to get some of the backstory of the lesson we'll be having this Sunday. So this Sunday at 10:30 a.m. at Christ the King Episcopal Church, we'll be hearing about the healing of the centurion's servant. Any other comments before we go, Tom?
No? Yes.
Yep. Good. Well, thank you very much, Tom, for sharing your knowledge with us, and we'll see you Sunday.
Okay. Thank
All right.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.